Chapter 16 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 16. In the course of another fortnight, I had seen sufficient of Frances Evans Henri to enable me to form a more definite opinion of her character. I found her possessed in a somewhat remarkable degree of at least two good points, viz., perseverance and a sense of duty. I found she was really capable of applying to study, of contending with difficulties. At first I offered her the same help which I had always found it necessary to confer on the others. I began with unloosing for her each knotty point, but I soon discovered that such help was regarded by my new pupil as degrading. She recoiled from it with a certain proud impatience. Hereupon I appointed her long lessons, and left her to solve alone any perplexities they might present. She set to the task with serious ardour, and having quickly accomplished one labour, eagerly demanded more. So much for her perseverance. As to her sense of duty, it evinced itself thus: she liked to learn, but hated to teach. Her progress as a pupil depended upon herself, and I saw that on herself she could calculate with certainty. Her success as a teacher rested partly, perhaps chiefly, upon the will of others. It cost her a most painful effort to enter into conflict with this foreign will, to endeavour to bend it into subjection to her own; for in what regarded people in general, the action of her will was impeded by many scruples. It was as unembarrassed as strong where her own affairs were concerned, and to it she could at any time subject her inclination, if that inclination went counter to her convictions of right. Yet when called upon to wrestle with the propensities, the habits, the faults of others, of children especially, who were deaf to reason, and for the most part insensate to persuasion, her will sometimes almost refused to act. Then came in the sense of duty, and forced the reluctant will into operation. A wasteful expense of energy and labour was frequently the consequence. Frances toiled for and with her pupils like a drudge, but it was long ere her conscientious exertions were rewarded by anything like docility on their part, because they saw that they had power over her, inasmuch as by resisting her painful attempts to convince, persuade, control, by forcing her to the employment of coercive measures, they could inflict upon her exquisite suffering. Human beings, human children especially, seldom deny themselves the pleasure of exercising a power which they are conscious of possessing, even though that power consist only in a capacity to make others wretched. A pupil whose sensations are duller than those of his instructor, while his nerves are tougher and his bodily strength perhaps greater, has an immense advantage over that instructor, and he will generally use it relentlessly, because the very young, very healthy, very thoughtless, know neither how to sympathize nor how to spare. Frances, I fear, suffered much. A continual weight seemed to oppress her spirits. I have said she did not live in the house, and whether in her own abode, wherever that might be, she wore the same preoccupied, unsmiling, sorrowfully resolved air that always shaded her features under the roof of Mademoiselle Reuter, I could not tell. One day I gave as a devoir the trite little anecdote of Alfred tending cakes in the herdsman's hut, to be related with amplifications. A singular affair most of the pupils made of it. Brevity was what they had chiefly studied. The majority of the narratives were perfectly unintelligible. Those of Sylvie and Leonie Ledru alone pretended to anything like sense and connection. Eulalie, indeed, had hit upon a clever expedient for at once ensuring accuracy and saving trouble. She had obtained access somehow to an abridged history of England, and had copied the anecdote out fair. I wrote on the margin of her production, "Stupid and deceitful," and then tore it down the middle. Last in the pile of single-leaved devoirs, I found one of several sheets, neatly written out and stitched together. I knew the hand, and scarcely needed the evidence of the signature, Francis Evans Henri, to confirm my conjecture as to the writer's identity. Night was my usual time for correcting devoirs, and my own room the usual scene of such task most onerous hitherto; and it seemed strange to me to feel rising within me an incipient sense of interest, as I snuffed out the candle and addressed myself to the perusal of the poor teacher's manuscript. Now, thought I shall see a glimpse of what she really is. I shall get an idea of the nature and extent of her powers. Not that she can be expected to express herself well in a foreign tongue, but still, if she has any mind, here will be a reflection of it. The narrative commenced by a description of a Saxon peasant's hut, situated within the confines of a great leafless winter forest. It represented an evening in December. Flakes of snow were falling, and the herdsman foretold a heavy storm. He summoned his wife to aid him in collecting their flock, roaming far away on the pastoral banks of the Thone. He warns her that it will be late ere they return. The good woman is reluctant to quit her occupation of baking cakes for the evening meal; but acknowledging the primary importance of securing the herds and flocks, she puts on her sheepskin mantle, and addressing a stranger who rests half reclined on a bed of rushes near the hearth, bids him mind the bread till her return. "Take care, young man," she continues, "that you fasten the door well after us, and above all, open to none in our absence. Whatever sound you hear, stir not and look not out. The night will soon fall. This forest is most wild and lonely. Strange noises are often heard therein after sunset. Wolves haunt these glades, and Danish warriors infest the country. Worse things are talked of. You might chance to hear, as it were, a child cry, and on opening the door to afford it succour, a great black bull or a shadowy goblin dog might rush over the threshold; or, more awful still, if something flapped, as with wings, against the lattice, and then a raven or a white dove flew in and settled on the hearth, such a visitor would be a sure sign of misfortune to the house. Therefore heed my advice, and lift the latchet for nothing." Her husband calls her away, both depart. The stranger, left alone, listens a while to the muffled snow wind, the remote swollen sound of the river, and then he speaks. "It is Christmas Eve," says he. "I mark the date. Here I sit alone on a rude couch of rushes, sheltered by the thatch of a herdsman's hut. I, whose inheritance was a kingdom, owe my night's harbourage to a poor serf. My throne is usurped, my crown presses the brow of an invader. I have no friends, my troops wander broken in the hills of Wales. Reckless robbers spoil my country, my subjects lie prostrate, their breasts crushed by the heel of the brutal Dane. Fate, thou hast done thy worst, and now thou standest before me resting thy hand on thy blunted blade. I see thine eye confront mine, and demand why I still live, why I still hope. Pagan demon, I credit not thine omnipotence, and so cannot succumb to thy power. My God, whose Son, as on this night, took on him the form of a man, and for man vouchsafed to suffer and bleed, controls thy hand, and without his behest thou canst not strike a stroke. My God is sinless, eternal, all-wise. In him is my trust; and though stripped and crushed by thee, though naked, desolate, void of resource, I do not despair, I cannot despair. Where the lance of Guthrum, now wet with my blood, I should not despair. I watch, I toil, I hope, I pray. Jehovah in his own time will aid. I need not continue the quotation, the whole devoir was in the same strain. There were errors of orthography, there were foreign idioms, there were some faults of construction, there were verbs irregular transformed into verbs regular. It was mostly made up, as the above example shows, of short and somewhat rude sentences, and the style stood in great need of polish and sustained dignity. Yet, such as it was, I had hitherto seen nothing like it in the course of my professorial experience. The girl's mind had conceived a picture of the hut, of the two peasants, of the crownless king. She had imagined the wintry forest, she had recalled the old Saxon ghost legends, she had appreciated Alfred's courage under calamity, she had remembered his Christian education, and had shown him with the rooted confidence of those primitive days, relying on the scriptural Jehovah for aid against the mythological destiny. This she had done without a hint from me. I had given the subject, but not said a word about the manner of treating it. I will find or make an opportunity of speaking to her, I said to myself as I rolled the devoir up. I will learn what she has of English in her besides the name of Frances Evans. She is no novice in the language, that is evident. Yet she told me she had neither been in England, nor taken lessons in English, nor lived in English families. In the course of my next lesson, I made a report of the other devoir, dealing out praise and blame in very small retail parcels, according to my custom, for there was no use in blaming severely, and high encomiums were rarely merited. I said nothing of Mademoiselle Henri's exercise, and, spectacles on nose, I endeavoured to decipher in her countenance her sentiments at the omission. I wanted to find out whether in her existed a consciousness of her own talents. If she thinks she did a clever thing in composing that devoir, she will now look mortified, thought I. Grave as usual, almost sombre was her face. As usual, her eyes were fastened on the cahier open before her. There was something, I thought, of expectation in her attitude, as I concluded a brief review of the last devoir, and when, casting it from me and rubbing my hands, I bade them take their grammars, some slight change did pass over her air and mien, as though she now relinquished a faint prospect of pleasant excitement. She had been waiting for something to be discussed in which she had a degree of interest. The discussion was not to come on, so expectation sank back, shrunk and sad. But attention, promptly filling up the void, repaired in a moment the transient collapse of feature. Still, I felt, rather than saw, during the whole course of the lesson, that a hope had been wrenched from her, and that if she did not show distress, it was because she would not. At 4 o'clock, when the bell rang and the room was in immediate tumult, instead of taking my hat and starting from the estrade, I sat still for a moment. I looked at Frances. She was putting her books into her cabas. Having fastened the button, she raised her head. Encountering my eye, she made a quiet, respectful obeisance, as bidding good afternoon, and was turning to depart. "Come here," said I, lifting my finger at the same time. She hesitated. She could not hear the words amidst the uproar now pervading both schoolrooms. I repeated the sign. She approached. Again she paused within half a yard of the estrade, and looked shy, and still doubtful whether she had mistaken my meaning. "Step up," I said, speaking with decision. It is the only way of dealing with diffident, easily embarrassed characters, and with some slight manual aid I presently got her placed just where I wanted her to be, that is, between my desk and the window, where she was screened from the rush of the second division, and where no one could sneak behind her to listen. "Take a seat," I said, placing a tabouret, and I made her sit down. I knew what I was doing would be considered a very strange thing, and what was more, I did not care. Frances knew it also, and I fear, by an appearance of agitation and trembling, that she cared much. I drew from my pocket the rolled-up devoir. "This is yours, I suppose," said I, addressing her in English, for I now felt sure she could speak English. "Yes," she answered distinctly, and as I unrolled it and laid it out flat on the desk before her with my hand upon it, and a pencil in that hand, I saw her moved and, as it were, kindled. Her depression beamed as a cloud might behind which the sun is burning. "This devoir has numerous faults," said I. "It will take you some years of careful study before you are in a condition to write English with absolute correctness. Attend, I will point out some principal defects." And I went through it carefully, noting every error, and demonstrating why they were errors, and how the words or phrases ought to have been written. In the course of this sobering process she became calm. I now went on. "As to the substance of your devoir, Mademoiselle Henri, it has surprised me. I perused it with pleasure, because I saw in it some proofs of taste and fancy. Taste and fancy are not the highest gifts of the human mind, but such as they are, you possess them. Not probably in a paramount degree, but in a degree beyond what the majority can boast. You may then take courage, cultivate the faculties that God and nature have bestowed on you, and do not fear in any crisis of suffering, under any pressure of injustice, to derive free and full consolation from the consciousness of their strength and rarity." Strength and rarity, I repeated to myself. Ay, the words are probably true, for on looking up, I saw the sun had dissevered its screening cloud, her countenance was transfigured, a smile shone in her eyes, a smile almost triumphant. It seemed to say, "I am glad that you have been forced to discover so much of my nature. You need not so carefully moderate your language. Do you think I am myself a stranger to myself? What you tell me in terms so qualified, I have known fully from a child." She did say this as plainly as a frank and flashing glance could, but in a moment the glow of her complexion, the radiance of her aspect, had subsided. If strongly conscious of her talents, she was equally conscious of her harassing defects, and the remembrance of these, obliterated for a single second, now reviving with sudden force, at once subdued the two vivid characters in which her sense of her powers had been expressed. So quick was the revulsion of feeling, I had not time to check her triumph by reproof. Ere I could contract my brows to a frown, she had become serious and almost mournful looking. "Thank you, sir," said she, rising. There was gratitude both in her voice and in the look with which she accompanied it. It was time indeed for our conference to terminate, for when I glanced around, behold, all the boarders, the day scholars had departed, were congregated within a yard or two of my desk, and stood staring with eyes and mouths wide open. The three maîtresses formed a whispering knot in one corner, and close at my elbow was the directress, sitting on a low chair, calmly clipping the tassels of her finished purse. End of chapter 16. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.
Of the Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barony. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 17. After all, I had profited but imperfectly by the opportunity I had so boldly achieved of speaking to Mademoiselle Henri. It was my intention to ask her how she came to be possessed of two English baptismal names, Frances and Evans, in addition to her French surname, also whence she derived her good accent. I had forgotten both points, or rather, our colloquy had been so brief that I had not had time to bring them forward. Moreover, I had not half tested her powers of speaking English. All I had drawn from her in that language were the words "yes" and "thank you, sir." No matter, I reflected. What has been left incomplete now shall be finished another day. nor did I fail to keep the promise thus made to myself. It was difficult to get even a few words of particular conversation with one pupil among so many, but according to the old proverb, where there is a will, there is a way, and again I managed to find an opportunity for exchanging a few words with Mademoiselle Henri, regardless that envy stared and detraction whispered whenever I approached her. "Your book an instant." Such was the mode in which I often began these brief dialogues. The time was always just at the conclusion of the lesson, and motioning to her to rise, I installed myself in her place, allowing her to stand deferentially at my side, for I esteemed it wise and right in her case to enforce strictly all forms ordinarily in use between master and pupil; the rather because I perceived that in proportion as my manner grew austere and magisterial, hers became easy and self-possessed, an odd contradiction, doubtless, to the ordinary effect in such cases, but so it was. "A pencil," said I, holding out my hand without looking at her. I am now about to sketch a brief report of the first of these conferences. She gave me one, and while I underlined some errors in a grammatical exercise she had written, I observed: "You are not a native of Belgium?" "No." "Nor of France?" "No." "Where, then, is your birthplace?" "I was born at Geneva." "You don't call Francis and Evans Swiss names, I presume?" "No, sir, they are English names." "Just so. And is it the custom of the Genevese to give their children English appellatives?" "No, monsieur, mais—" "Speak English, if you please." "Mais—" "English." "But," slowly and with embarrassment, "my parents were not all the two Genevièves." "Say both, instead of all the two, mademoiselle." "Not both Swiss. My mother was English." "Ah, and of English extraction?" "Yes, her ancestors were all English." "And your father?" "He was Swiss." "What besides? What was his profession?" "Ecclesiastic, pastor. He had a church." "Since your mother is an Englishwoman, why do you not speak English with more facility?" "Maman est morte il y a 10 ans." "And you do homage to her memory by forgetting a language. Have the goodness to put French out of your mind so long as I converse with you. Keep to English." "C'est si difficile, monsieur, quand on n'en a plus l'habitude." "You had the habitude formerly, I suppose. Now answer me in your mother tongue." "Yes, sir, I spoke the English more than the French when I was a child." "Why do you not speak it now?" "Because I have no English friends." "You live with your father, I suppose?" "My father is dead." "You have brothers and sisters?" "Not one." "Do you live alone?" "No, I have an aunt, ma tante Julienne." "Your father's sister?" "Justement, monsieur." "Is that English?" "No, but I forget." "For which, mademoiselle, if you were a child, I should certainly devise some slight punishment. At your age you must be 2 or 3 and 20, I should think." "Pas encore, monsieur. En un mois j'aurai 19 ans." "Well, 19 is a mature age, and having attained it, you ought to be so solicitous for your own improvement that it should not be needful for a master to remind you twice of the expediency of your speaking English whenever practicable." To this wise speech I received no answer, and when I looked up, my pupil was smiling to herself a much meaning though not very gay smile. It seemed to say, "He talks of he knows not what." It said this so plainly that I determined to request information on the point concerning which my ignorance seemed to be thus tacitly affirmed. "Are you solicitous for your own improvement?" "Rather." "How do you prove it, mademoiselle?" An odd question, and bluntly put. It excited a second smile. "Why, monsieur, I am not inattentive, am I? I learn my lessons well." Oh, a child can do that. And what more do you do?"
"What more can I do?"
"Oh, certainly not much. But you are a teacher, are you not, as well as a pupil?"
"Yes."
"You teach lace mending?"
"Yes."
"A dull, stupid occupation. Do you like it?"
"No, it is tedious."
"Why do you pursue it? Why do you not rather teach history, geography, grammar, even arithmetic?"
"Is Monsieur certain that I am myself thoroughly acquainted with these studies?"
"I do not know. You ought to be at your age."
"But I never was at school, Monsieur."
"Indeed! What then were your friends? What was your aunt about? She is very much to blame."
"No, Monsieur, no, my aunt is good. She is not to blame. She does what she can. She lodges and nourishes me."
I report Mademoiselle Henri's phrases literally, and it was thus she translated from the French.
"She is not rich. She has only an annuity of 1200 francs, and it would be impossible for her to send me to school."
Rather, thought I to myself on hearing this, but I continued, in the dogmatical tone I had adopted. "It is sad, however, that you should be brought up in ignorance of the most ordinary branches of education. Had you known something of history and grammar, you might by degrees have relinquished your lace-mending drudgery and risen in the world."
"It is what I mean to do."
"How? By a knowledge of English alone? That will not suffice. No respectable family will receive a governess whose whole stock of knowledge consists in a familiarity with one foreign language."
"Monsieur, I know other things."
Yes, yes, you can work with Berlin wools, and embroider handkerchiefs and collars. That will do little for you." Mademoiselle Henri's lips were unclosed to answer, but she checked herself, as thinking the discussion had been sufficiently pursued, and remained silent. "Speak," I continued impatiently. "I never like the appearance of acquiescence when the reality is not there, and you had a contradiction at your tongue's end."
"Monsieur, I have had many lessons both in grammar, history, geography, and arithmetic. I have gone through a course of each study."
"Bravo! But how did you manage it, since your aunt could not afford to send you to school?"
"By lace mending, by the thing Monsieur despises so much."
"Truly? And now, mademoiselle, it will be a good exercise for you to explain to me in English how such a result was produced by such means."
"Monsieur, I begged my aunt to have me taught lace mending soon after we came to Brussels, because I knew it was a métier, a trade which was easily learnt, and by which I could earn some money very soon. I learnt it in a few days, and I quickly got work, for all the Brussels ladies have old lace, very precious, which must be mended all the times it is washed. I earned money a little, and this money I gave for lessons in the studies I have mentioned. Some of it I spent in buying books, English books especially. Soon I shall try to find a place of governess or school teacher, when I can write and speak English well, but it will be difficult, because those who know I have been a lace mender will despise me, as the pupils here despise me. Pourtant j'ai mon projet," she added in a lower tone.
"What is it?"
"I will go and live in England. I will teach French there."
The words were pronounced emphatically. She said England, as you might suppose an Israelite of Moses' days would have said Canaan. "Have you a wish to see England?"
"Yes, and an intention."
And here a voice, the voice of the directress, interposed. "Mademoiselle Henri, je crois qu'il va pleuvoir. Vous feriez bien, ma bonne amie, de retourner chez vous tout de suite." In silence, without a word of thanks for this officious warning, Mademoiselle Henri collected her books. She moved to me respectfully, endeavoured to move to her superior, though the endeavour was almost a failure, for her head seemed as if it would not bend, and thus departed. Where there is one grain of perseverance or wilfulness in the composition, trifling obstacles are ever known rather to stimulate than discourage. Mademoiselle Reuter might as well have spared herself the trouble of giving that intimation about the weather. By the by, her prediction was falsified by the event. It did not rain that evening. At the close of the next lesson I was again at Mademoiselle Henri's desk. Thus did I accost her. "What is your idea of England, mademoiselle? Why do you wish to go there?" Accustomed by this time to the calculated abruptness of my manner, it no longer discomposed or surprised her, and she answered with only so much of hesitation as was rendered inevitable by the difficulty she experienced in improvising the translation of her thoughts from French to English.
"England is something unique, as I have heard and read. My idea of it is vague, and I want to go there to render my idea clear, definite."
"Hum! How much of England do you suppose you could see if you went there in the capacity of a teacher? A strange notion you must have of getting a clear and definite idea of a country. All you could see of Great Britain would be the interior of a school, or at most of 1 or 2 private dwellings."
"It would be an English school. There would be English dwellings."
"Indisputably. But what then? What would be the value of observations made on a scale so narrow?"
"Monsieur, might not one learn something by analogy? An échantillon, a sample, often serves to give an idea of the whole. Besides, narrow and wide are words comparative, are they not? All my life would perhaps seem narrow in your eyes. All the life of a what little animal subterranean, un taupe, comment dit-on?
Mole.
Yes, a mole which lives underground would seem narrow even to me."
"Well, mademoiselle, what then? Proceed."
"Mais, monsieur, vous me comprenez."
"Not in the least. Have the goodness to explain."
"Why, monsieur, it is just so. In Switzerland I have done but little, learnt but little, and seen but little. My life there was in a circle. I walked the same round every day. I could not get out of it. Had I rested, remained there even till my death, I could never have enlarged it, because I am poor and not skilful. I have not great acquirements. When I was quite tired of this round, I begged my aunt to go to Brussels. My existence is no larger here, because I am no richer or higher. I walk in as narrow a limit. But the scene is changed. It would change again if I went to England. I knew something of the bourgeois of Geneva. Now I know something of the bourgeois of Brussels. If I went to London, I would know something of the bourgeois of London. Can you make any sense out of what I say, monsieur, or is it all obscure?"
"I see. Now let us advert to another subject. You propose to devote your life to teaching, and you are a most unsuccessful teacher. You cannot keep your pupils in order." A flush of painful confusion was the result of this harsh remark. She bent her head to the desk, but soon raising it, replied,
"Monsieur, I am not a skilful teacher, it is true, but practice improves. Besides, I work under difficulties. Here I only teach sewing. I can show no power in sewing, no superiority. It is a subordinate art. Then I have no associates in this house. I am isolated. I am, too, a heretic, which deprives me of influence."
"And in England you would be a foreigner. That too would deprive you of influence, and would effectually separate you from all round you. In England you would have as few connections, as little importance as you have here."
"But I should be learning something. For the rest, there are probably difficulties for such as I everywhere, and if I must contend and perhaps be conquered, I would rather submit to English pride than to Flemish coarseness. Besides, monsieur—"
She stopped, not evidently from any difficulty in finding words to express herself, but because discretion seemed to say, "You have said enough." "Finish your phrase," I urged.
"Besides, monsieur, I long to live once more among Protestants. They are more honest than Catholics. A Romish school is a building with porous walls, a hollow floor, a false ceiling. Every room in this house, monsieur, has eye holes and ear holes, and what the house is, the inhabitants are very treacherous. They all think it lawful to tell lies. They all call it politeness to profess friendship where they feel hatred.
All? said I. You mean the pupils, the mere children, inexperienced giddy things, who have not learnt to distinguish the difference between right and wrong.
On the contrary, monsieur, the children are the most sincere. They have not yet had time to become accomplished in duplicity. They will tell lies, but they do it inartificially, and you know they are lying. But the grown-up people are very false. They deceive strangers. They deceive each other.
A servant here entered.
Mademoiselle Henri, Mademoiselle Reuter vous prie de vouloir bien conduire la petite de Dolodo chez elle. Elle vous attend dans le cabinet de Rosalie la portière. C'est que ce bon n'est pas venu la chercher, voyez-vous.
Eh bien,
est-ce que je suis sa bonne, moi?
demanded Mademoiselle Henri. Then smiling, with that same bitter, derisive smile I had seen on her lips once before, she hastily rose and made her exit. End of chapter 17. Recording by Barony.
Chapter 18 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 18. The young Anglo-Swiss evidently derived both pleasure and profit from the study of her mother tongue. In teaching her, I did not, of course, confine myself to the ordinary school routine. I made instruction in English a channel for instruction in literature. I prescribed to her a course of reading. She had a little selection of English classics, a few of which had been left her by her mother, and the others she had purchased with her own penny fee. I lent her some more modern works. All these she read with avidity, giving me in writing a clear summary of each work when she had perused it. Composition, too, she delighted in. Such occupation seemed the very breath of her nostrils, and soon her improved productions wrung from me the avowal that those qualities in her I had termed taste and fancy ought rather to have been denominated judgment and imagination. When I intimated so much, which I did as usual in dry and stinted phrase, I looked for the radiant and exulting smile my one word of eulogy had elicited before. But Frances coloured. If she did smile, it was very softly and shyly, and instead of looking up to me with a conquering glance, her eyes rested on my hand, which, stretched over her shoulder, was writing some directions with a pencil on the margin of her book. "Well, are you pleased that I am satisfied with your progress?" I asked. "Yes," said she, slowly, gently, the blush that had half subsided returning. "But I do not say enough, I suppose," I continued. "My praises are too cool." She made no answer, and I thought looked a little sad. I divined her thoughts, and should much have liked to have responded to them, had it been expedient so to do. She was not now very ambitious of my admiration, not eagerly desirous of dazzling me. A little affection, ever so little, pleased her better than all the panegyrics in the world. Feeling this, I stood a good while behind her, writing on the margin of her book. I could hardly quit my station or relinquish my occupation. Something retained me bending there, my head very near hers, and my hand near hers too. But the margin of a copybook is not an illimitable space. So doubtless the directress thought, and she took occasion to walk past in order to ascertain by what art I prolonged so disproportionately the period necessary for filling it. I was obliged to go. Distasteful effort to leave what we most prefer. Frances did not become pale or feeble in consequence of her sedentary employment. Perhaps the stimulus it communicated to her mind counterbalanced the inaction it imposed on her body. She changed, indeed changed obviously and rapidly, but it was for the better. When I first saw her, her countenance was sunless, her complexion colourless. She looked like one who had no source of enjoyment, no store of bliss anywhere in the world. Now the cloud had passed from her mien, leaving space for the dawn of hope and interest, and those feelings rose like a clear morning, animating what had been depressed, tinting what had been pale. Her eyes, whose colour I had not at first known, so dim were they with repressed tears, so shadowed with ceaseless dejection, now, lit by a ray of the sunshine that cheered her heart, revealed irids of bright hazel, irids large and full, screened with long lashes, and pupils instinct with fire. That look of wan emaciation, which anxiety or low spirits often communicates to a thoughtful, thin face, rather long than round, having vanished from hers, a clearness of skin almost bloom, and a plumpness almost embonpoint, softened the decided lines of her features. Her figure shared in this beneficial change; it became rounder, and as the harmony of her form was complete, and her stature of the graceful middle height, one did not regret, or at least I did not regret, the absence of confirmed fullness, in contours still slight, though compact, elegant, flexible, the exquisite turning of waist, wrist, hand, foot, and ankle satisfied completely my notions of symmetry, and allowed a lightness and freedom of movement which corresponded with my ideas of grace. Thus improved, thus wakened to life, Mademoiselle Henri began to take a new footing in the school. Her mental power, manifested gradually but steadily, ere long extorted recognition even from the envious; and when the young and healthy saw that she could smile brightly, converse gaily, move with vivacity and alertness, they acknowledged in her a sisterhood of youth and health, and tolerated her as of their kind accordingly. To speak truth, I watched this change much as a gardener watches the growth of a precious plant, and I contributed to it too, even as the said gardener contributes to the development of his favourite. To me it was not difficult to discover how I could best foster my pupil, cherish her starved feelings, and induce the outward manifestation of that inward vigour which sunless drought and blighting blast had hitherto forbidden to expand. Constancy of attention, a kindness as mute as watchful, always standing by her, cloaked in the rough garb of austerity, and making its real notion known only by a rare glance of interest, or a cordial and gentle word; real respect masked with seeming imperiousness; directing, urging her actions, yet helping her too, and that with devoted care. These were the means I used, for these means best suited Frances's feelings, as susceptible as deep vibrating, her nature at once proud and shy. The benefits of my system became apparent also in her altered demeanour as a teacher. She now took her place among her pupils with an air of spirit and firmness, which assured them at once that she meant to be obeyed. And obeyed she was. They felt they had lost their power over her. If any girl had rebelled, she would no longer have taken her rebellion to heart. She possessed a source of comfort they could not drain, a pillar of support they could not overthrow. Formerly, when insulted, she wept; now she smiled. The public reading of one of her devoirs achieved the revelation of her talents to all and sundry. I remember the subject. It was an emigrant's letter to his friends at home. It opened with simplicity. Some natural and graphic touches disclosed to the reader the scene of the virgin forest and great New World river, barren of sail and flag, amidst which the epistle was supposed to be indited. The difficulties and dangers that attend a settler's life were hinted at, and in the few words said on that subject, Mademoiselle Henri failed not to render audible the voice of resolve, patience, endeavour. The disasters which had driven him from his native country were alluded to. Stainless honour, inflexible independence, indestructible self-respect there took the word. Past days were spoken of, the grief of parting, the regrets of absence were touched upon. Feeling, forcible and fine, breathed eloquent in every period. At the close, consolation was suggested. Religious faith became there the speaker, and she spoke well. The devoir was powerfully written in language at once chaste and choice, in a style nerved with vigour and graced with harmony. Mademoiselle Reuter was quite sufficiently acquainted with English to understand it when read or spoken in her presence, though she could neither speak nor write it herself. During the perusal of this devoir, she sat placidly busy, her eyes and fingers occupied with the formation of a rivière, or open-work hem, round a cambric handkerchief. She said nothing, and her face and forehead, clothed with a mask of purely negative expression, were as blank of comment as her lips. As neither surprise, pleasure, approbation, nor interest were evinced in her countenance, so no more were disdain, envy, annoyance, weariness. If that inscrutable mien said anything, it was simply this: the matter is too trite to excite an emotion or call forth an opinion. As soon as I had done, a hum rose. Several of the pupils, pressing round Mademoiselle Henri, began to beset her with compliments. The composed voice of the directress was now heard. "Young ladies, such of you as have cloaks and umbrellas will hasten to return home before the shower becomes heavier." It was raining a little. "The remainder will wait till their respective servants arrive to fetch them." And the school dispersed, for it was 4 o'clock. "Monsieur, a word," said Mademoiselle Reuter, stepping on to the estrade, and signifying by a movement of the hand that she wished me to relinquish for an instant the castor I had clutched. "Mademoiselle, I am at your service." "Monsieur, it is of course an excellent plan to encourage effort in young people, by making conspicuous the progress of any particularly industrious pupil. But do you not think that in the present instance, Mademoiselle Henri can hardly be considered as a concurrent with the other pupils? She is older than most of them, and has had advantages of an exclusive nature for acquiring a knowledge of English. On the other hand, her sphere of life is somewhat beneath theirs. Under these circumstances, a public distinction conferred upon Mademoiselle Henri may be the means of suggesting comparisons, and exciting feelings such as would be far from advantageous to the individual forming their object. The interest I take in Mademoiselle Henri's real welfare makes me desirous of screening her from annoyances of this sort. Besides, monsieur, as I have before hinted to you, the sentiment of amour-propre has a somewhat marked preponderance in her character. Celebrity has a tendency to foster this sentiment, and in her it should be rather repressed. She rather needs keeping down than bringing forward. And then I think, monsieur, it appears to me that ambition, literary ambition especially, is not a feeling to be cherished in the mind of a woman. Would not Mademoiselle Henri be much safer and happier if taught to believe that in the quiet discharge of social duties consists her real vocation, than if stimulated to aspire after applause and publicity. She may never marry. Scanty as are her resources, obscure as are her connections, uncertain as is her health, for I think her consumptive. Her mother died of that complaint. It is more than probable she never will. I do not see how she can rise to a position whence such a step would be possible. But even in celibacy, it would be better for her to retain the character and habits of a respectable, decorous female. Indisputably, mademoiselle, was my answer. Your opinion admits of no doubt. And fearful of the harangue being renewed, I retreated under cover of that cordial sentence of assent. At the date of a fortnight after the little incident noted above, I find it recorded in my diary that a hiatus occurred in Mademoiselle Henri's usually regular attendance in class. The first day or two I wondered at her absence, but did not like to ask an explanation of it. I thought indeed some chance word might be dropped which would afford me the information I wished to obtain, without my running the risk of exciting silly smiles and gossiping whispers by demanding it. But when a week passed, and the seat at the desk near the door still remained vacant, and when no allusion was made to the circumstance by any individual of the class, when, on the contrary, I found that all observed a marked silence on the point, I determined, coûte qui coûte, to break the ice of this silly reserve. I selected Sylvie as my informant, because from her I knew that I should at least get a sensible answer, unaccompanied by wriggle, titter, or other flourish of folly. "Où donc est Mademoiselle Henri?" I asked one day, as I returned an exercise book I had been examining. "Elle est partie, monsieur." "Partie? Et pour combien de temps? Quand reviendra-t-elle?" "Elle est partie pour toujours, monsieur. Elle ne reviendra plus." "Ah!" was my involuntary exclamation. Then, after a pause, "En êtes-vous bien sûre, Sylvie?" "Oui, oui, monsieur. Mademoiselle la directrice nous l'a dit elle-même, il y a 2 ou 3 jours." And I could pursue my inquiries no further. Time, place, and circumstances forbade my adding another word. I could neither comment on what had been said, nor demand further particulars. A question as to the reason of the teacher's departure, as to whether it had been voluntary or otherwise, was indeed on my lips, but I suppressed it. There were listeners all round. An hour after, in passing Sylvie in the corridor as she was putting on her bonnet, I stopped short and asked, "Sylvie, do you know Mademoiselle Henri's address? I have some books of hers," I added carelessly, "and I should wish to send them to her." "No, monsieur," replied Sylvie, "but perhaps Rosalie, the portress, will be able to give it to you." Rosalie's cabinet was just at hand. I stepped in and repeated the inquiry. Rosalie, a smart French grisette, looked up from her work with a knowing smile, precisely the sort of smile I had been so desirous to avoid exciting. Her answer was prepared. She knew nothing whatever of Mademoiselle Henri's address, had never known it. Turning from her with impatience, for I believe she lied and was hired to lie, I almost knocked down some one who had been standing at my back. It was the directress. My abrupt movement made her recoil 2 or 3 steps. I was obliged to apologize, which I did more concisely than politely. No man likes to be dogged, and in the very irritable mood in which I then was, the sight of Mademoiselle Reuter instantly incensed me. At the moment I turned, her countenance looked hard, dark, and inquisitive. Her eyes were bent upon me with an expression of almost hungry curiosity. I had scarcely caught this phase of physiognomy ere it had vanished. A bland smile played on her features. My harsh apology was received with good-humoured facility. "Oh, don't mention it, monsieur. You only touched my hair with your elbow. It is no worse, only a little dishevelled." She shook it back, and passing her fingers through her curls, loosened them into more numerous and flowing ringlets. Then she went on with vivacity: "Rosalie, I was coming to tell you to go instantly and close the windows of the salon. The wind is rising, and the muslin curtains will be covered with dust." Rosalie departed. Now, thought I, this will not do. Mademoiselle Reuter thinks her meanness in eavesdropping is screened by her art in devising a pretext, whereas the muslin curtains she speaks of are not more transparent than this same pretext. An impulse came over me to thrust the flimsy screen aside and confront her craft boldly with a word or two of plain truth. The rough-shod foot treads most firmly on slippery ground, thought I. So I began. Mademoiselle Henri has left your establishment, been dismissed, I presume. "Ah, I wish to have a little conversation with you, monsieur," replied the directress with the most natural and affable air in the world. "But we cannot talk quietly here. Will monsieur step into the garden a minute?" And she preceded me, stepping out through the glass door I have before mentioned. "There," said she, when we had reached the centre of the middle alley, and when the foliage of shrubs and trees, now in their summer pride, closing behind and around us, shut out the view of the house, and thus imparted a sense of seclusion, even to this little plot of ground in the very core of a capital. "There, one feels quiet and free when there are only pear trees and rose bushes about one. I dare say you, like me, monsieur, are sometimes tired of being eternally in the midst of life, of having human faces always round you, human eyes always upon you, human voices always in your ear. I am sure I often wish intensely for liberty to spend a whole month in the country, at some little farmhouse, bien gentille, bien propre, tout entouré de champs et de bois. Quelle vie charmante que la vie champêtre, n'est-ce pas, monsieur?" "Cela dépend, mademoiselle." "Que le vent est bon et frais," continued the directress. And she was right there, for it was a south wind, soft and sweet. I carried my hat in my hand, and this gentle breeze, passing through my hair, soothed my temples like balm. Its refreshing effect, however, penetrated no deeper than the mere surface of the frame, for as I walked by the side of Mademoiselle Reuter, my heart was still hot within me, and while I was musing, the fire burned. Then spake I with my tongue: "I understand Mademoiselle Henri is gone from hence, and will not return." "Ah, true. I meant to have named the subject to you some days ago, but my time is so completely taken up, I cannot do half the things I wish. Have you never experienced what it is, monsieur, to find the day too short by 12 hours for your numerous duties?" "Not often. Mademoiselle Henri's departure was not voluntary, I presume. If it had been, she would certainly have given me some intimation of it, being my pupil." "Oh, did she not tell you? That was strange. For my part, I never thought of adverting to the subject. When one has so many things to attend to, one is apt to forget little incidents that are not of primary importance." "You consider Mademoiselle Henri's dismission, then, as a very insignificant event?" "Dismission? Ah, she was not dismissed. I can say with truth, monsieur, that since I became the head of this establishment, no master or teacher has ever been dismissed from it. Yet some have left it, mademoiselle." "Many. I have found it necessary to change frequently. A change of instructors is often beneficial to the interests of a school. It gives life and variety to the proceedings. It amuses the pupils and suggests to the parents the idea of exertion and progress." "Yet when you are tired of a professor or maîtresse, you scruple to dismiss them? No need to have recourse to such extreme measures, I assure you. Allons, monsieur le professeur, asseyons-nous. Je vais vous donner une petite leçon, dans votre état d'instituteur. I wish I might write all she said to me in French. It loses sadly by being translated into English. We had now reached the garden chair. The directress sat down and signed to me to sit by her, but I only rested my knee on the seat and stood leaning my head and arm against the embowering branch of a huge laburnum, whose golden flowers, blent with the dusky green leaves of a lilac bush, formed a mixed arch of shade and sunshine over the retreat. Mademoiselle Reuter sat silent a moment. Some novel movements were evidently working in her mind, and they showed their nature on her astute brow. She was meditating some chef d'oeuvre of policy. Convinced by several months' experience that the affectation of virtues she did not possess was unavailing to ensnare me, aware that I had read her real nature and would believe nothing of the character she gave out as being hers, she had determined at last to try a new key, and see if the lock of my heart would yield to that. A little audacity, a word of truth, a glimpse of the real. Yes, I will try, was her inward resolve. And then her blue eye glittered upon me. It did not flash. Nothing of flame ever kindled its temperate gleam. "Monsieur fears to sit by me?" she inquired playfully. "I have no wish to usurp Pelet's place," I answered, for I had got the habit of speaking to her bluntly, a habit begun in anger, but continued because I saw that, instead of offending, it fascinated her. She cast down her eyes and drooped her eyelids. She sighed uneasily. She turned with an anxious gesture, as if she would give me the idea of a bird that flutters in its cage, and would fain fly from its jail and jailer, and seek its natural mate and pleasant nest. "Well, and your lesson?" I demanded briefly. "Ah!" she exclaimed, recovering herself, "you are so young, so frank and fearless, so talented, so impatient of imbecility, so disdainful of vulgarity. You need a lesson. Here it is then. Far more is to be done in this world by dexterity than by strength. But perhaps you knew that before, for there is delicacy as well as power in your character, policy as well as pride." "Go on," said I, and I could hardly help smiling, the flattery was so piquant, so finely seasoned. She caught the prohibited smile, though I passed my hand over my mouth to conceal it, and again she made room for me to sit beside her. I shook my head, though temptation penetrated to my senses at the moment, and once more I told her to go on. "Well, then, if ever you are at the head of a large establishment, dismiss nobody. To speak truth, monsieur, and to you I will speak truth, I despise people who are always making rows, blustering, sending off one to the right and another to the left, urging and hurrying circumstances. I'll tell you what I like best to do, monsieur, shall I?" She looked up again. She had compounded her glance well this time. Much archness, more deference, a spicy dash of coquetry, an unveiled consciousness of capacity. I nodded. She treated me like the Great Mogul, so I became the Great Mogul as far as she was concerned. "I like, monsieur, to take my knitting in my hands and to sit quietly down in my chair. Circumstances defile past me, I watch their march. So long as they follow the course I wish, I say nothing and do nothing. I don't clap my hands and cry out, 'Bravo! How lucky I am!' to attract the attention and envy of my neighbours. I am merely passive. But when events fall out ill, when circumstances become adverse, I watch very vigilantly. I knit on still, and still I hold my tongue. But every now and then, monsieur, I just put my toe out, so, and give the rebellious circumstance a little secret push, without noise, which sends it the way I wish, and I am successful after all, and nobody has seen my expedient. So when teachers or masters become troublesome and inefficient, when, in short, the interests of the school would suffer from their retaining their places, I mind my knitting, events progress, circumstances glide past. I see one, if pushed ever so little awry, will render untenable the post I wish to have vacated. The deed is done, the stumbling block removed, and no one saw me. I have not made an enemy, I am rid of an encumbrance. A moment since, and I thought her alluring. This speech concluded, I looked on her with distaste. Just like you, was my cold answer. And in this way you have ousted Mademoiselle Henri? You wanted her office, therefore you rendered it intolerable to her. Not at all, monsieur. I was merely anxious about Mademoiselle Henri's health. No, your moral sight is clear and piercing, but there you have failed to discover the truth. I have always taken a real interest in Mademoiselle Henri's welfare. I did not like her going out in all weathers. I thought it would be more advantageous for her to obtain a permanent situation. Besides, I consider her now qualified to do something more than teach sewing. I reasoned with her, left the decision to herself. She saw the correctness of my views, and adopted them. Excellent. And now, mademoiselle, you will have the goodness to give me her address. Her address? And a sombre and stony change came over the mien of the directress. Her address? Ah! Well, I wish I could oblige you, monsieur, but I cannot, and I will tell you why. Whenever I myself asked her for her address, she always evaded the inquiry. I thought, I may be wrong, but I thought her motive for doing so was a natural, though mistaken, reluctance to introduce me to some probably very poor abode. Her means were narrow, her origin obscure. She lives somewhere, doubtless, in the Basse Ville. I'll not lose sight of my best pupil yet, said I, though she were born of beggars and lodged in a cellar. For the rest, it is absurd to make a bugbear of her origin to me. I happen to know that she was a Swiss pastor's daughter, neither more nor less; and as to her narrow means, I care nothing for the poverty of her purse, so long as her heart overflows with affluence. Your sentiments are perfectly noble, monsieur, said the directress, affecting to suppress a yawn. Her sprightliness was now extinct, her temporary candour shut up. The little red-coloured, piratical-looking pennon of audacity she had allowed to float a minute in the air was now furled, and the broad, sober-hued flag of dissimulation again hung low over the citadel. I did not like her thus, so I cut short the tete-a-tete and departed. End of chapter 18. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 19 of The Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 19, Part 1. Novelists should never allow themselves to weary of the study of real life. If they observed this duty conscientiously, they would give us fewer pictures checkered with vivid contrasts of light and shade. They would seldom elevate their heroes and heroines to the heights of rapture, still seldomer sink them to the depths of despair. For if we rarely taste the fullness of joy in this life, we yet more rarely savour the acrid bitterness of hopeless anguish; unless, indeed, we have plunged like beasts into sensual indulgence, abused, strained, stimulated, again overstrained, and at last destroyed our faculties for enjoyment. Then, truly, we may find ourselves without support, robbed of hope. Our agony is great, and how can it end? We have broken the spring of our powers. Life must be all suffering, too feeble to conceive faith. Death must be darkness. God, spirits, religion can have no place in our collapsed minds, where linger only hideous and polluting recollections of vice. And time brings us on to the brink of the grave, and dissolution flings us in, a rag eaten through and through with disease, wrung together with pain, stamped into the churchyard sod by the inexorable heel of despair. But the man of regular life and rational mind never despairs. He loses his property, it is a blow. He staggers a moment. Then his energies, roused by the smart, are at work to seek a remedy. Activity soon mitigates regret. Sickness affects him, he takes patience, endures what he cannot cure. Acute pain racks him, his writhing limbs know not where to find rest. He leans on hope's anchors. Death takes from him what he loves, roots up and tears violently away the stem round which his affections were twined. A dark, dismal time, a frightful wrench. But some morning religion looks into his desolate house with sunrise, and says that in another world, another life, he shall meet his kindred again. She speaks of that world as a place unsullied by sin, of that life as an era unembittered by suffering. She mightily strengthens her consolation by connecting it with two ideas, which mortals cannot comprehend, but on which they love to repose: eternity, immortality. And the mind of the mourner, being filled with an image, faint yet glorious, of heavenly hills all light and peace, of a spirit resting there in bliss, of a day when his spirit shall also alight there, free and disembodied, of a reunion perfected by love, purified from fear, he takes courage, goes out to encounter the necessities and discharge the duties of life. And though sadness may never lift her burden from his mind, hope will enable him to support it. Well, and what suggested all this? And what is the inference to be drawn therefrom? What suggested it is the circumstance of my best pupil, my treasure, being snatched from my hands and put away out of my reach. The inference to be drawn from it is, that, being a steady, reasonable man, I did not allow the resentment, disappointment, and grief engendered in my mind by this evil chance to grow there to any monstrous size, nor did I allow them to monopolize the whole space of my heart. I pent them, on the contrary, in one straight and secret nook. In the daytime, too, when I was about my duties, I put them on the silent system, and it was only after I had closed the door of my chamber at night that I somewhat relaxed my severity towards these morose nurslings, and allowed vent to their language of murmurs. Then, in revenge, they sat on my pillow, haunted my bed, and kept me awake with their long midnight cry. A week passed. I had said nothing more to Mademoiselle Reuter. I had been calm in my demeanour to her, though stony cold and hard. When I looked at her, it was with the glance fitting to be bestowed on one who I knew had consulted jealousy as an adviser, and employed treachery as an instrument, the glance of quiet disdain and rooted distrust. On Saturday evening, ere I left the house, I stepped into the salle à manger, where she was sitting alone, and placing myself before her, I asked with the same tranquil tone and manner that I should have used had I put the question for the first time, "Mademoiselle, Will you have the goodness to give me the address of Frances Evans Henri?" A little surprised, but not disconcerted, she smilingly disclaimed any knowledge of that address, adding, "Monsieur has perhaps forgotten that I explained all about that circumstance before, a week ago." "Mademoiselle," I continued, "you would greatly oblige me by directing me to that young person's abode." She seemed somewhat puzzled, and at last, looking up with an admirably counterfeited air of naivete, she demanded, "Does monsieur think I am telling an untruth?" Still avoiding to give her a direct answer, I said, "It is not your intention then, mademoiselle, to oblige me in this particular?" "But, monsieur, how can I tell you what I do not know?" "Very well, I understand you perfectly, mademoiselle, and now I have only 2 or 3 words to say. This is the last week in July; in another month the vacation will commence. Have the goodness to avail yourself of the leisure it will afford you to look out for another English master. At the close of August I shall be under the necessity of resigning my post in your establishment." I did not wait for her comments on this announcement, but bowed and immediately withdrew. That same evening, soon after dinner, a servant brought me a small packet. It was directed in a hand I knew, but had not hoped so soon to see again. Being in my own apartment, and alone, there was nothing to prevent my immediately opening it. It contained 4 5-franc pieces, and a note in English. "Monsieur, I came to Mademoiselle Reuter's house yesterday, at the time when I knew you would be just about finishing your lesson, and I asked if I might go into the schoolroom and speak to you. Mademoiselle Reuter came out and said you were already gone. It had not yet struck 4, so I thought she must be mistaken, but concluded it would be vain to call another day on the same errand. In one sense the note will do as well; it will wrap up the 20 francs, the price of the lessons I have received from you, and if it will not fully express the thanks I owe you in addition, if it will not bid you good-bye, as I could wish to have done, if it will not tell you, as I long to do, how sorry I am that I shall probably never see you more, why, spoken words would hardly be more adequate to the task. Had I seen you, I should probably have stammered out something feeble and unsatisfactory, something belying my feelings rather than explaining them. So it is perhaps as well that I was denied admission to your presence. You often remarked, monsieur, that my devoirs dwelt a great deal on fortitude in bearing grief. You said I introduced that theme too often. I find indeed that it is much easier to write about a severe duty than to perform it, for I am oppressed when I see and feel to what a reverse fate has condemned me. You were kind to me, monsieur, very kind. I am afflicted, I am heartbroken to be quite separated from you. Soon I shall have no friend on earth. But it is useless troubling you with my distresses. What claim have I on your sympathy? None. I will then say no more. Farewell, monsieur. F.E. Henri. I put up the note in my pocket-book. I slipped the 5-franc pieces into my purse, then I took a turn through my narrow chamber. Mademoiselle Reuter talked about her poverty, said I, and she is poor, yet she pays her debts and more. I have not yet given her a quarter's lessons, and she has sent me a quarter's due. I wonder of what she deprived herself to scrape together the 20 francs. I wonder what sort of a place she has to live in, and what sort of a woman her aunt is, and whether she is likely to get employment to supply the place she has lost. No doubt she will have to trudge about long enough from school to school, to inquire here and apply there, to be rejected in this place, disappointed in that. Many an evening she'll go to her bed tired and unsuccessful, and the directress would not let her in to bid me good-bye. I might not have the chance of standing with her for a few minutes at a window in the schoolroom and exchanging some half-dozen of sentences, getting to know where she lived, putting matters in train for having all things arranged to my mind. No address on the note, I continued, drawing it again from the pocket-book and examining it on each side of the 2 leaves. Women are women, that is certain, and always do business like women. Men mechanically put a date and address to their communications. And these 5-franc pieces? I hauled them forth from my purse. If she had offered me them herself, instead of tying them up with a thread of green silk in a kind of Lilliputian packet, I could have thrust them back into her little hand and shut up the small taper fingers over them, so, and compelled her shame, her pride, her shyness, all to yield to a little bit of determined will. Now where is she? How can I get at her? Opening my chamber door, I walked down into the kitchen. Who brought the packet? I asked of the servant who had delivered it to me. Un petit commissionnaire, monsieur. Did he say anything? Rien. And I wended my way up the back stairs, wondrously the wiser for my inquiries. No matter, said I to myself as I again closed the door. No matter, I'll seek her through Brussels. And I did. I sought her day by day, whenever I had a moment's leisure, for 4 weeks. I sought her on Sundays all day long. I sought her on the boulevards, in the Allée Verte, in the park. I sought her in Sainte-Gudule and in Saint-Jacques. I sought her in the 2 Protestant chapels. I attended these latter at the German, French, and English services, not doubting that I should meet her at one of them. All my researches were absolutely fruitless. My security on the last point was proved by the event to be equally groundless with my other calculations. I stood at the door of each chapel after the service, and waited till every individual had come out, scrutinizing every gown draping a slender form, peering under every bonnet covering a young head. In vain. I saw girlish figures pass me, drawing their black scarfs over their sloping shoulders, but none of them had the exact turn and air of Mademoiselle Henri's. I saw pale and thoughtful faces, encadrées in bands of brown hair, but I never found her forehead, her eyes, her eyebrows. All the features of all the faces I met seemed frittered away, because my eye failed to recognize the peculiarities it was bent upon, an ample space of brow, and a large, dark, and serious eye, with a fine but decided line of eyebrow traced above. She has probably left Brussels, perhaps is gone to England, as she said she would, muttered I inwardly, as on the afternoon of the 4th Sunday I turned from the door of the Chapel Royal, which the doorkeeper had just closed and locked, and followed in the wake of the last of the congregation, now dispersed and dispersing over the square. I had soon outwalked the couples of English gentlemen and ladies. Gracious goodness, why don't they dress better? My eye is yet filled with visions of the high-flounced, slovenly, and tumbled dresses in costly silk and satin, of the large unbecoming collars in expensive lace, of the ill-cut coats and strangely fashioned pantaloons which every Sunday at the English service filled the choirs of the Chapel Royal, and after it, issuing forth into the square, came into disadvantageous contrast with freshly and trimly attired foreign figures, hastening to attend salut at the church of Coburg. I had passed these pairs of Britons, and the groups of pretty British children, and the British footmen and waiting maids. I had crossed the Place Royale, and got into the Rue Royale, thence I had diverged into the Rue de Louvain, an old and quiet street. I remember that, feeling a little hungry, and not desiring to go back and take my share of the goûter now on the refectory table at Pelet's, to wit, pistolet and water, I stepped into a baker's, and refreshed myself on a koek. It is a Flemish word, I don't know how to spell it, a courant anglais, a currant bun, and a cup of coffee. And then I strolled on towards the Porte de Louvain. Very soon I was out of the city, and slowly mounting the hill which ascends from the gate. I took my time, for the afternoon, though cloudy, was very sultry, and not a breeze stirred to refresh the atmosphere. No inhabitant of Brussels need wander far to search for solitude, Let him but move half a league from his own city, and he will find her brooding still and blank over the wide fields, so drear though so fertile, spread out treeless and trackless round the capital of Brabant. Having gained the summit of the hill, and having stood and looked long over the cultured but lifeless campaign, I felt a wish to quit the high road which I had hitherto followed, and get in among those tilled grounds, fertile as the beds of a Brobdingnagian kitchen garden, spreading far and wide even to the boundaries of the horizon, where, from a dusk green, distance changed them to a sullen blue, and confused their tints with those of the livid and thunderous looking sky. Accordingly I turned up a by-path to the right. I had not followed it far ere it brought me, as I expected, into the fields, amidst which, just before me, stretched a long and lofty white wall, enclosing, as it seemed from the foliage showing above, some thickly planted nursery of yew and cypress, for of that species were the branches resting on the pale parapets, and crowding gloomily about a massive cross, planted doubtless on a central eminence and extending its arms, which seemed of black marble, over the summits of those sinister trees. I approached, wondering to what house this well-protected garden appertained. I turned the angle of the wall, thinking to see some stately residence. I was close upon great iron gates. There was a hut serving for a lodge near, but I had no occasion to apply for the key. The gates were open. I pushed one leaf back. Rain had rusted its hinges, for it groaned dolefully as they revolved. Thick planting embowered the entrance. Passing up the avenue, I saw objects on each hand, which, in their own mute language of inscription and sign, explained clearly to what abode I had made my way. This was the house appointed for all living. Crosses, monuments, and garlands of everlastings announced the Protestant cemetery outside the gate of Louvain. The place was large enough to afford half an hour's strolling without the monotony of treading continually the same path; and for those who love to peruse the annals of graveyards, here was variety of inscription enough to occupy the attention for double or treble that space of time. Hither, people of many kindreds, tongues, and nations had brought their dead for interment; and here, on pages of stone, of marble, and of brass, were written names, dates, last tributes of pomp or love, in English, in French, in German, and Latin. Here the Englishman had erected a marble monument over the remains of his Mary Smith or Jane Brown, and inscribed it only with her name. There the French widower had shaded the grave of his Elmire or Celestine with a brilliant thicket of roses, amidst which a little tablet rising bore an equally bright testimony to her countless virtues. Every nation, tribe, and kindred mourned after its own fashion, and how soundless was the mourning of all. My own tread, though slow and upon smooth-rolled paths, seemed to startle, because it formed the sole break to a silence otherwise total. Not only the winds, but the very fitful, wandering airs, were that afternoon, as by common consent, all fallen asleep in their various quarters. The north was hushed, the south silent, the east sobbed not, nor did the west whisper. The clouds in heaven were condensed and dull, but apparently quite motionless. Under the trees of this cemetery nestled a warm, breathless gloom, out of which the cypresses stood up straight and mute, above which the willows hung low and still, where the flowers, as languid as fair, waited listless for night dew or thunder shower, where the tombs, and those they hid, lay impassible to sun or shadow, to rain or drought. Importuned by the sound of my own footsteps, I turned off upon the turf, and slowly advanced to a grove of yews. I saw something stir among the stems. I thought it might be a broken branch swinging. My short-sighted vision had caught no form, only a sense of motion. But the dusky shade passed on, appearing and disappearing at the openings in the avenue. I soon discerned it was a living thing, and a human thing; and drawing nearer, I perceived it was a woman, pacing slowly to and fro, and evidently deeming herself alone as I had deemed myself alone, and meditating as I had been meditating. Ere long she returned to a seat, which I fancy she had but just quitted, or I should have caught sight of her before. It was in a nook, screened by a clump of trees. There was the white wall before her, and a little stone set up against the wall, and at the foot of the stone was an allotment of turf freshly turned up, a new-made grave. I put on my spectacles, and passed softly close behind her. Glancing at the inscription on the stone, I read, Julienne Henri, died at Brussels, aged 60, August 10th, 18... Having perused the inscription, I looked down at the form, sitting bent and thoughtful just under my eyes, unconscious of the vicinity of any living thing. It was a slim, youthful figure, in mourning apparel of the plainest black stuff, with a little simple black crape bonnet. I felt as well as saw who it was, and moving neither hand nor foot, I stood some moments enjoying the security of conviction. I had sought her for a month, and had never discovered one of her traces, never met a hope or seized a chance of encountering her anywhere. I had been forced to loosen my grasp on expectation, and but an hour ago had sunk slackly under the discouraging thought that the current of life and the impulse of destiny had swept her for ever from my reach. And behold! While bending suddenly earthward beneath the pressure of despondency, while following with my eyes the track of sorrow on the turf of a graveyard, here was my lost jewel, dropped on the tear-fed herbage, nestling in the messy and mouldy roots of yew trees. Frances sat very quiet, her elbow on her knee, and her head on her hand. I knew she could retain a thinking attitude a long time without change. At last a tear fell. She had been looking at the name on the stone before her, and her heart had no doubt endured one of those constrictions with which the desolate living, regretting the dead, are at times so sorely oppressed. Many tears rolled down, which she wiped away again and again with her handkerchief. Some distressed sobs escaped her, and then, the paroxysm over, she sat quiet as before. I put my hand gently on her shoulder, no need further to prepare her, for she was neither hysterical nor liable to fainting fits. A sudden push, indeed, might have startled her, but the contact of my quiet touch merely woke attention as I wished. And though she turned quickly, yet so lightning swift is thought, in some minds especially, I believe the wonder of what, the consciousness of who it was that thus stole unawares on her solitude, had passed through her brain and flashed into her heart even before she had effected that hasty movement. At least amazement had hardly opened her eyes and raised them to mine, ere recognition informed their irids with the most speaking brightness. Nervous surprise had hardly discomposed her features, ere a sentiment of most vivid joy shone clear and warm on her whole countenance. I had hardly time to observe that she was wasted and pale, ere called to feel a responsive inward pleasure by the sense of most full and exquisite pleasure glowing in the animated flush and shining in the expansive light now diffused over my pupil's face. It was the summer sun flashing out after the heavy summer shower, and what fertilizes more rapidly than that beam, burning almost like fire in its ardour. End of chapter 19, part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Of the Professor. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Professor, by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 19, Part 2. I hate boldness, the boldness which is of the brassy brow and insensate nerves, but I love the courage of the strong heart, the fervour of the generous blood. I loved with passion the light of Francis Evans's clear hazel eye when it did not fear to look straight into mine. I loved the tones with which she uttered the words, "Mon maître, mon maître." I loved the movement with which she confided her hand to my hand. I loved her as she stood there, penniless and parentless, for a sensualist, charmless, for me a treasure, the best object of sympathy on earth, thinking such thoughts as I thought, feeling such feelings as I felt, my ideal of the shrine in which to seal my stores of love, personification of discretion and forethought, of diligence and perseverance, of self-denial and self-control. Those guardians, those trusty keepers of the gift I longed to confer on her, the gift of all my affections, model of truth and honour, of independence and conscientiousness, those refiners and sustainers of an honest life, silent possessor of a well of tenderness, of a flame as genial as still, as pure as quenchless, of natural feeling, natural passion, those sources of refreshment and comfort to the sanctuary of home. I knew how quietly and how deeply the well bubbled in her heart. I knew how the more dangerous flame burned safely under the eye of reason. I had seen when the fire shot up a moment, high and vivid, when the accelerated heat troubled life's current in its channels. I had seen reason reduce the rebel and humble its blaze to embers. I had confidence in Frances Evans. I had respect for her. And as I drew her arm through mine and led her out of the cemetery, I felt I had another sentiment as strong as confidence, as firm as respect, more fervid than either, that of love. "Well, my pupil," said I, as the ominous-sounding gate swung to behind us, "well, I have found you again. A month's search has seemed long, and I little thought to have discovered my lost sheep straying amongst graves." Never had I addressed her but as mademoiselle before, and to speak thus was to take up a tone new to both her and me. Her answer surprised me that this language ruffled none of her feelings, woke no discord in her heart. "Mon maître," she said, "have you troubled yourself to seek me? I little imagined you would think much of my absence, but I grieved bitterly to be taken away from you. I was sorry for that circumstance when heavier troubles ought to have made me forget it." "Your aunt is dead?" "Yes, a fortnight since, and she died full of regret which I could not chase from her mind. She kept repeating, even during the last night of her existence, 'Francis, you will be so lonely when I am gone, so friendless.' She wished, too, that she could have been buried in Switzerland, and it was I who persuaded her in her old age to leave the banks of Lake Leman, and to come, only as it seems to die, in this flat region of Flanders. Willingly would I have observed her last wish and taken her remains back to our own country, but that was impossible. I was forced to lay her here." "She was ill but a short time, I presume?" "But 3 weeks. When she began to sink, I asked Mademoiselle Reuter's leave to stay with her and wait on her. I readily got leave." "Do you return to the pensionnat?" I demanded hastily. "Monsieur, when I had been at home a week, Mademoiselle Reuter called one evening, just after I had got my aunt to bed. She went into her room to speak to her, and was extremely civil and affable, as she always is. Afterwards she came and sat with me a long time, and just as she rose to go away, she said, 'Mademoiselle, I shall not soon cease to regret your departure from my establishment, though indeed it is true that you have taught your class of pupils so well that they are all quite accomplished in the little works you manage so skilfully, and have not the slightest need of further instruction. My second teacher must in future supply your place with regard to the younger pupils, as well she can, though she is indeed an inferior artiste to you, and doubtless it will be your part now to assume a higher position in your calling. I am sure you will everywhere find schools and families willing to profit by your talents." And then she paid me my last quarter's salary. I asked, as mademoiselle would no doubt think very bluntly, if she designed to discharge me from the establishment. She smiled at my inelegance of speech, and answered that our connection as employer and employed was certainly dissolved, but that she hoped still to retain the pleasure of my acquaintance. She should always be happy to see me as a friend. And then she said something about the excellent condition of the streets, and the long continuance of fine weather, and went away quite cheerful. I laughed inwardly. All this was so like the directress, so like what I had expected and guessed of her conduct. And then the exposure and proof of her lie unconsciously afforded by Frances. She had frequently applied for Mademoiselle Henri's address, forsooth. Mademoiselle Henri had always evaded giving it, etc., etc., and here I found her a visitor at the very house of whose locality she had professed absolute ignorance. Any comments I might have intended to make on my pupil's communication were checked by the plashing of large raindrops on our faces and on the path, and by the muttering of a distant but coming storm. The warning obvious in stagnant air and leaden sky had already induced me to take the road leading back to Brussels, and now I hastened my own steps and those of my companion, and as our way lay downhill we got on rapidly. There was an interval after the fall of the first broad drops before heavy rain came on. In the meantime we had passed through the Porte de Louvain, and were again in the city. "Where do you live?" I asked. "I will see you safe home." "Rue Notre-Dame-aux-Neiges," answered Frances. It was not far from the Rue de Louvain, and we stood on the doorsteps of the house we sought ere the clouds, severing with loud peal and shattered cataract of lightning, emptied their livid folds in a torrent, heavy, prone, and broad. Come in," said Frances, as, after putting her into the house, I paused ere I followed. The word decided me. I stepped across the threshold, shut the door on the rushing, flashing, whitening storm, and followed her upstairs to her apartments. Neither she nor I were wet. A projection over the door had warded off the straight descending flood. None but the first large drops had touched our garments. 1 minute more, and we should not have had a dry thread on us. Stepping over a little mat of green wool, I found myself in a small room with a painted floor and a square of green carpet in the middle. The articles of furniture were few, but all bright and exquisitely clean. Order reigned through its narrow limits, such order as it soothed my punctilious soul to behold. And I had hesitated to enter the abode, because I apprehended after all that Mademoiselle Reuter's hint about its extreme poverty might be too well founded, and I feared to embarrass the lace mender by entering her lodgings unawares. Poor the place might be, poor truly it was, but its neatness was better than elegance, and had but a bright little fire shone on that clean hearth, I should have deemed it more attractive than a palace. No fire was there, however, and no fuel laid ready to light. The lace mender was unable to allow herself that indulgence, especially now when, deprived by death of her sole relative, she had only her own unaided exertions to rely on. Frances went into an inner room to take off her bonnet, and she came out a model of frugal neatness, with her well-fitting black stuff dress, so accurately defining her elegant bust and taper waist, with her spotless white collar turned back from a fair and shapely neck, with her plenteous brown hair arranged in smooth bands on her temples, and in a large Grecian plait behind. Ornaments she had none, neither brooch, ring, nor ribbon. She did well enough without them. Perfection of fit, proportion of form, grace of carriage, agreeably supplied their place. Her eye, as she re-entered the small sitting-room, instantly sought mine, which was just then lingering on the hearth. I knew she read at once the sort of inward ruth and pitying pain which the chill vacancy of that hearth stirred in my soul. Quick to penetrate, quick to determine, and quicker to put in practice, she had in a moment tied a holland apron round her waist. Then she disappeared, and reappeared with a basket. It had a cover. She opened it, and produced wood and coal. Deftly and compactly she arranged them in the grate. It is her whole stock, and she will exhaust it out of hospitality, thought I. What are you going to do? I asked. Surely not to light a fire this hot evening. I shall be smothered. Indeed, monsieur, I feel it very chilly since the rain began. Besides, I must boil the water for my tea, for I take tea on Sundays. You will be obliged to try and bear the heat. She had struck a light. The wood was already in a blaze, and truly, when contrasted with the darkness, the wild tumult of the tempest without, that peaceful glow which began to beam on the now animated hearth seemed very cheering. A low purring sound from some quarter announced that another being, besides myself, was pleased with the change. A black cat, roused by the light from its sleep on a little cushioned footstool, came and rubbed its head against Frances's gown as she knelt. She caressed it, saying it had been a favourite with her pauvre tante Julienne. The fire being lit, the hearth swept, and a small kettle of a very antique pattern, such as I thought I remembered to have seen in old farmhouses in England, placed over the now ruddy flame, Frances's hands were washed, and her apron removed in an instant. Then she opened a cupboard, took out a tea tray, on which she had soon arranged a china tea equipage, whose pattern, shape, and size denoted a remote antiquity. A little old-fashioned silver spoon was deposited in each saucer, and a pair of silver tongs, equally old-fashioned, were laid on the sugar basin. From the cupboard, too, was produced a tidy silver cream ewer, not larger than an eggshell. While making these preparations, she chanced to look up, and reading curiosity in my eyes, she smiled, and asked, "Is this like England, monsieur?" "Like the England of 100 years ago," I replied. "Is it truly? Well, everything on this tray is at least 100 years old. These cups, these spoons, this ewer are all heirlooms. My great-grandmother left them to my grandmother, she to my mother, and my mother brought them with her from England to Switzerland, and then left them to me. And ever since I was a little girl, I have thought I should like to carry them back to England, whence they came." She put some pistolets on the table. She made the tea as foreigners do make tea, i.e. at the rate of a teaspoonful to half a dozen cups. She placed me in a chair, and as I took it, she asked with a sort of exultation, "Will it make you think yourself at home for a moment?" "If I had a home in England, I believe it would recall it," I answered. And in truth there was a sort of illusion in seeing the fair-complexioned English-looking girl presiding at the English meal, and speaking in the English language. "You have then no home?" was her remark. "None, nor ever have had. If ever I possess a home, it must be of my own making, and the task is yet to begin." And as I spoke, a pang new to me shot across my heart. It was a pang of mortification at the humility of my position, and the inadequacy of my means, while with that pang was born a strong desire to do more, earn more, be more, possess more. And in the increased possessions my roused and eager spirit panted to include the home I have never had, the wife I inwardly vowed to win. Frances's tea was little better than hot water, sugar, and milk, and her pistolets, with which she could not offer me butter, were sweet to my palate as manna. The repast over, and the treasured plate and porcelain being washed and put by, the bright table rubbed still brighter, le chat de ma tante Julienne also being fed with provisions brought forth on a plate for its special use, a few stray cinders and a scattering of ashes too being swept from the hearth, Frances at last sat down, and then, as she took a chair opposite to me, she betrayed for the first time a little embarrassment. And no wonder, for indeed I had unconsciously watched her rather too closely, followed all her steps and all her movements a little too perseveringly with my eyes, for she mesmerized me by the grace and alertness of her action, by the deft, cleanly, even decorative effect resulting from each touch of her slight and fine fingers. And when at last she subsided to stillness, the intelligence of her face seemed beauty to me, and I dwelt on it accordingly. Her colour, however, rising rather than settling with repose, and her eyes remaining downcast, though I kept waiting for the lids to be raised that I might drink a ray of the light I loved, a light where fire dissolved in softness, where affection tempered penetration, where just now at least pleasure played with thought. This expectation not being gratified, I began at last to suspect that I had probably myself to blame for the disappointment. I must cease gazing, and begin talking, if I wished to break the spell under which she now sat motionless. So, recollecting the composing effect which an authoritative tone and manner had ever been wont to produce on her, I said, "Get one of your English books, mademoiselle, for the rain yet falls heavily, and will probably detain me half an hour longer." Released and set at ease, up she rose, got her book, and accepted at once the chair I placed for her at my side. She had selected Paradise Lost from her shelf of classics, thinking, I suppose, the religious character of the book best adapted it to Sunday. I told her to begin at the beginning, and while she read Milton's invocation to that heavenly muse, who on the secret top of Oreb or Sinai had taught the Hebrew shepherd how in the womb of chaos the conception of a world had originated and ripened, I enjoyed undisturbed the treble pleasure of having her near me, hearing the sound of her voice, a sound sweet and satisfying in my ear, and looking by intervals at her face. Of this last privilege I chiefly availed myself when I found fault with an intonation, a pause, or an emphasis. As long as I dogmatized, I might also gaze, without exciting too warm a flush. "Enough," said I, when she had gone through some half-dozen pages, a work of time with her, for she read slowly, and paused often to ask and receive information. "Enough, and now the rain is ceasing, and I must soon go." For indeed at that moment, looking towards the window, I saw it all blue, the thunderclouds were broken and scattered, and the setting August sun sent a gleam like the reflection of rubies through the lattice. I got up, I drew on my gloves. "You have not yet found another situation to supply the place of that from which you were dismissed by Mademoiselle Reuter?" "No, monsieur. I have made inquiries everywhere, but they all ask me for references; and to speak truth, I do not like to apply to the directress, because I consider she acted neither justly nor honourably towards me. She used underhand means to set my pupils against me, and thereby render me unhappy while I held my place in her establishment, and she eventually deprived me of it by a masked and hypocritical manoeuvre, pretending that she was acting for my good, but really snatching from me my chief means of subsistence, at a crisis when not only my own life, but that of another, depended on my exertions. Of her I will never more ask a favour." "How then do you propose to get on? How do you live now?" "I have still my lace-mending trade. With care it will keep me from starvation, and I doubt not by dint of exertion to get better employment yet. It is only a fortnight since I began to try. My courage or hopes are by no means worn out yet." "And if you get what you wish, what then? What are your ultimate views?" "To save enough to cross the Channel. I always look to England as my Canaan." "Well, well, ere long I shall pay you another visit. Good evening now." And I left her rather abruptly. I had much ado to resist a strong inward impulse, urging me to take a warmer, more expressive leave. What so natural as to fold her for a moment in a close embrace, to imprint one kiss on her cheek or forehead? I was not unreasonable, that was all I wanted. Satisfied in that point, I could go away content. and reason denied me even this. She ordered me to turn my eyes from her face, and my steps from her apartment, to quit her as dryly and coldly as I would have quitted old Madame Pelet. I obeyed, but I swore rancorously to be avenged one day. I'll earn a right to do as I please in this matter, or I'll die in the contest. I have one object before me now, to get that Genevese girl for my wife, and my wife she shall be. That is, provided she has as much or half as much regard for her master as he has for her. And would she be so docile, so smiling, so happy under my instructions if she had not? Would she sit at my side when I dictate or correct, with such a still, contented, halcyon mien? For I had ever remarked that however sad or harassed her countenance might be when I entered a room, yet after I had been near her, spoken to her a few words, given her some directions, uttered perhaps some reproofs, she would all at once nestle into a nook of happiness, and look up serene and revived. The reproofs suited her best of all. While I scolded, she would chip away with her penknife at a pencil or a pen, fidgeting a little, pouting a little, defending herself by monosyllables; and when I deprived her of the pen or pencil, fearing it would be all cut away, and when I interdicted even the monosyllabic defence for the purpose of working up the subdued excitement a little higher, she would at last raise her eyes and give me a certain glance, sweetened with gaiety, and pointed with defiance, which, to speak truth, thrilled me as nothing had ever done, and made me, in a fashion, though happily she did not know it, her subject, if not her slave. After such little scenes, her spirits would maintain their flow, often for some hours, and, as I remarked before, her health therefrom took a sustenance and vigour which, previously to the event of her aunt's death and her dismissal, had almost recreated her whole frame. It has taken me several minutes to write these last sentences, but I had thought all their purport during the brief interval of descending the stairs from Frances' room. Just as I was opening the outer door, I remembered the 20 francs which I had not restored. I paused. Impossible to carry them away with me, difficult to force them back on their original owner. I had now seen her in her own humble abode, witnessed the dignity of her poverty, the pride of order, the fastidious care of conservatism, obvious in the arrangement and economy of her little home. I was sure she would not suffer herself to be excused paying her debts. I was certain the favour of indemnity would be accepted from no hand, perhaps least of all from mine. Yet these 4 5-franc pieces were a burden to my self-respect, and I must get rid of them. An expedient, a clumsy one no doubt, but the best I could devise, suggested itself to me. I darted up the stairs, knocked, re-entered the room as if in haste. "Mademoiselle, I have forgotten one of my gloves. I must have left it here." She instantly rose to seek it, and as she turned her back, I, being now at the hearth, noiselessly lifted a little vase, one of a set of china ornaments, as old-fashioned as the teacups, slipped the money under it, then saying, "Oh, here is my glove," I dropped it within the fender. "Good evening, mademoiselle." I made my second exit. Brief as my impromptu return had been, it had afforded me time to pick up a heartache. I remarked that Frances had already removed the red embers of her cheerful little fire from the grate. Forced to calculate every item, to save in every detail, she had instantly, on my departure, retrenched a luxury too expensive to be enjoyed alone. I am glad it is not yet winter, thought I, but in 2 months more come the winds and rains of November. Would to God that before then I could earn the right and the power to shovel coals into that grate ad libitum. Already the pavement was drying. A balmy and fresh breeze stirred the air, purified by lightning. I felt the west behind me, where spread a sky like opal, azure immingled with crimson, The enlarged sun, glorious in Tyrian tints, dipped his brim already. Stepping, as I was, eastward, I faced a vast bank of clouds, but also I had before me the arch of an evening rainbow, a perfect rainbow, high, wide, vivid. I looked long. My eye drank in the scene, and I suppose my brain must have absorbed it; for that night, after lying awake in pleasant fever a long time, watching the silent sheet lightning which still played among the retreating clouds and flashed silvery over the stars, I at last fell asleep, and then in a dream were reproduced the setting sun, the bank of clouds, the mighty rainbow. I stood, methought, on a terrace. I leaned over a parapeted wall. There was a space below me, depth I could not fathom, but hearing an endless dash of waves, I believed it to be the sea. Sea spread to the horizon. Sea of changeful green and intense blue. All was soft in the distance, all vapour veiled. A spark of gold glistened on the line between water and air, floated up, approached, enlarged, changed. The object hung midway between heaven and earth, under the arch of the rainbow. The soft but dusk clouds diffused behind. It hovered as on wings. Pearly, fleecy, gleaming air streamed like raiment round it. Light, tinted with carnation, coloured what seemed face and limbs. A large star shone with still lustre on an angel's forehead. An upraised arm and hand, glancing like a ray, pointed to the bow overhead, and a voice in my heart whispered, "Hope smiles on effort." End of chapter 19, part 2. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.